A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. I begin, as I always begin, in the name of Allah, whose grace I seek in this and all other matters. Welcome, welcome. It is my distinct pleasure to have my friend el-Farouk Khaki to speak with us today and also open up to any comments or questions you might have. First, I'll read his bio. El-Farouk Khaki, he, him, is a lawyer whose practice since 1993 focuses on refugee claims based on sexual orientation, gender, gender identity expression, and HIV. He is a co-owner of the Glad Day Bookshop, the world's oldest LGBTQI bookshop. He is an activist, public speaker, writer, author, and media commentator on Islam, LGBTQI, human rights, refugees, politics, racism, HIV, and queer parenting. El-Farouk is the founder of Salam, Queer Muslim Community, 1991, make note of that date, all of you newbies, and co-founder and imam of El Tawheed Jum'ah Circle, the Unity Mosque, 2009. He is ordained as a reverend and officiates marriage for all orientations and genders. He is featured in a biopic, The Accidental Activist, by the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. And hopefully I'll be confident enough to put the link in the chat if anybody wants to access that. His awards include the Excellence in Spirituality Award, Pride Toronto 2006, and the Community One Stein Art and Ferriaro Award. In 2020, he was induced into the Archives National Portrait Collection. El-Farouk's writings include a children's book titled Moon Dragon in the Mosque Garden, co-authored with his husband, Troy Jackson. There's also a link for that I'll put in the chat. He is currently working on a book exploring Islam, intersectional identities, global issues, sexuality, refugees, social justice, and spirituality. My brother, you have the floor.
I'm working on that book in my spare time, which I have plenty of, as you can tell. Salam alaikum, everybody. And hello, I'm el-Farouk. I go by he, him pronouns, and I am in Toronto, Canada, the traditional territories of a number of different First Nations, most recently in the stewardship of the Mississaugas of the New Credit. You've heard my bio. The Unity Mosque is gender equal, and I think maybe I need better words, or we need better words to describe that, because we welcome all genders, and gender equal might suggest that there is a binary, but I'm not quite sure. So I'm willing to, I'd like some feedback at some point from folks if they have any thoughts on that. But we're LGBTIQ affirming. We welcome all kinds of Muslims and non-Muslims. I'll talk a little bit about the masjid, and then sort of, you know, the notion. I was asked the other day when one of my speaking engagements about why we open up our space to non-Muslims. I'd like to see the mosque as a spiritual well, as a well of wellness. And Allah in the Quran tells us that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was sent as Rahmat al-Alameen, as a mercy to the worlds. So how do you access that mercy if you cannot actually hear the message or cannot see the message? And so the notion of a masjid that opens up, and of course, from my understanding of our histories and so on, even during the Prophet's time, the masjid was open to people who were not Muslim, and were welcomed into that space. And so the idea being that we're all welcome. We are, all kinds of Muslims are welcome, and Muslim being self-defined. And so a lot of the folks that come into the Unity Mosque also have syncretic understandings, often multiplicity of identities, multi-faith families, multiracial families, et cetera, et cetera. So we have a real sort of diverse community. We've been online exclusively online since March 2020 because of COVID. And because of that, I think we've always had an international component or a multinational component, because at the beginning we had access by Skype and then by Facebook Live, and now, but since going on Zoom and exclusively on Zoom because of COVID, I think our spread has widened, but it's also shifted because now there is no in real life component at this point in time. And so my neighbors who are a 5-minute walk down the block are as far away as somebody who's in Singapore or in Colombia or elsewhere, zooming into us. I started the space with my husband, Troy. He wasn't my husband at that time. And a friend of ours, Lori Silvers. And Lori Silvers is an American academic, converts to Islam. And she moved up to Toronto for love. And we had known each other online for a while. And a number of things sort of happened. And she approached me. And I had through the years, from starting with Salam, had notions around starting sort of an inclusive space and so on and so forth. And there were starts and fails and starts and fails and things that worked for small periods of time. The Peace Iftar started in 2003, inspired by a Jewish Seder during Passover, as to how we share tradition. And so we started the Peace Iftar, and we've had up to 300 people, Muslims and non-Muslims, fasting and non-fasting, breaking bread together. We organized Jummas with female-led Jummas and other events. And in 2003, I was the host for the Salam Al-Fatiha International Queer Muslim Conference here in Toronto. And interestingly enough, it was during the first SARS, and there was a travel advisory against Toronto. So we were expecting hundreds of folks from the United States, as had happened in previous Al-Fatiha conferences. And since we were just across the border, but however, the travel advisory meant that we only had about 30 or 40. But as Amina said at the beginning, that's who was meant to be there. So we had 150 people registered at the conference from around the world, but mostly Canada and the United States. And Ghazala Anwar was our imam, and it was the first time that I'm aware of in Canada that we had female-led prayers. We tried to start up a regular thing after that. It didn't work. And so I really do think that a large part of our existence in our community building is actually made possible by the internet and by the connections that have been made possible through the media that have opened up to us and being able to connect us across the world. So it's sometime in early 2009, Lori came to me after a particular experience in a community and said, let's do this. And Troy was new to Islam. I was born into Islam, and Lori had been Muslim for a long time. And I said to Lori, I can't do this without Troy. I have to have his buy-in. And he bought in. And so we started the space, and alhamdulillah, it's been a joy and a pain, and it's had its ups and its downs. And I acknowledge that some of my folks are here today, and thank you for being here. I'm very blessed. There's some amazing people in our community. And I was reflecting on today after Amina asked me, and I said, friends along the way. And I thought, and I have to admit, I haven't seen, even though I'm on your Patreon, I haven't actually watched anything because I don't have a lot of time to watch anything. So I was thinking about how Amina and I met and how we have become friends and family along this journey. Amina, you had a a not so joyous experience in Malaysia around the HIV conference. And at some point, and I read about that and I thought, wow, who's this? I love this, right? Not necessarily being in that situation, but who's got the guts to do this, right? And sometime later, I was introduced to Amina by email, and I think, but I'm not sure, that it might have been Faisal Alam. And he said to me, he said in the email that Amina, after her experience in Malaysia, had wanted to connect with queer Muslims to better understand and to better connect with their experience. Because if she was treated that way just for talking and saying the things that she did, what is the lived reality of queer Muslims? And so Amina and I began an email conversation and had a number of exchanges. Amina was brought up to speak at York University and the Noor Center in February of 2005. And when I learned of that, and the Noor Center is actually a liberal Muslim community. Women and men pray right and left. There's no segregation other than that sort of, there's no partitions and there's no segregation outside of the prayer hall, and the segregation is fairly loose, especially on the Eids when families are sort of clumped all in the center of the hallway. And it's also a place where women give khutbahs and can call azan and so on and so forth. And they hold the chair for Islamic studies at York University. And so they'd invited Amina. When I learned of that, and the Noor Center is a place that we do go to, and salam Simi Jan, and hello friends. And so I reached out to Amina and I said, you're coming to Toronto. Do you have time to hang out? And would you like to meet any other folks? There's a much longer and deeper story to all of this, but we did end up hanging out. Amina's luggage didn't come with her. I had to dress her. And we ended up spending a lot of time together. And it was just around the time of the first anniversary of my long-term partner's death. And Guy had lived with HIV for a long time and passed away in February of 2004. So we got to talk about the HIV, we got to talk about all the stigma and the this and the that, and about the coming together of folks and dealing with loss like this and so on. And of course, Amina's prayer was coming up and in New York the following month, but I had already booked my ticket to Vancouver to celebrate my mom's birthday with her and my dad, who was still alive at that time. And but we spent a good part of that weekend together, right? And it was a joy. And I have to say that Amina is an inspiration, and even the name of the masjid as Al Tawheed, and Amina being notorious and famous and unique in her explorations of Tawheed, is the foundation of our masjid. And so over the years, we've kept in contact, we've kept in touch, and our lives intersected for a number of years more actively. I was trying to remember whether we brought you up here 2 times or 3 times with the masjid, because you came up a number of times. I think it was 2. I think you're long overdue after COVID to come back to Toronto, inshallah. But we had a number of meetings and gatherings in South Africa, in Cape Town in particular, hosted by the Al-Fitra Foundation, also known as the Inner Circle, at the annual international retreat. I had been invited in 2010 and then not invited back until 2014. In 2010, I fell in love. My family's from Tanzania. We had to leave. It wasn't a matter of choice per se. And we didn't have a lot of money when we left because it wasn't a planned move and so on and so forth. And there was a lot of trauma, right, for my parents, I think, particularly for my father. So he actually never got back. He passed away in 2012. And he had never wanted to go back. But in 2010, I was invited to South Africa for this conference, and I was also on a separate research trip a couple of months later, on a project that was looking at anti-sodomy laws in formerly British occupied Africa. And was also looking at South Africa as a country which had then enshrined LGBT rights in its constitution, the only place in Africa. And so for me, I get teary every time I go to South Africa or I think about it, because it is going home, even though it's the home that I had never been to before. Because it's the only part in Africa where I can be who I am and what I am without being afraid and without looking over my shoulder. It doesn't mean that there are no risk or safety issues, but when we go to Tanzania or we go to Kenya, Troy and I have to go to separate lines, right? And now we're faced with the challenge of how do we take our child to visit my 80-something-year-old aunt when there's two dads on the birth certificate. Canadian birth certificates allow for up to 4 parents. There's no gender, but identified on the certificates. But still, if somebody says, where's the mother? There's no mother. Our child was born to us through surrogacy. And there is no other parent. There's 2 parents, me and Troy, on that birth certificate. So how do you negotiate something like that, right? So going to South Africa, and particularly for me to go to Cape Town, because there is no racial majority in Cape Town. It's a reflection of my life, of my community, and it's a going home. So when I was invited back in 2014, I said to Troy, I said, and my husband is Black Nova Scotian of mixed Black, European, and Indigenous DNA. And I said, you have to come and to the conference. And he had been with me to as far as Kenya and Zanzibar in 2010 for that research trip that I had been on. So we had booked our ticket and we ended up getting married. And I say we ended up getting married. Amina alluded to this in her posting and also earlier. In 2014, Toronto hosted World Pride. And I was asked to be one of the officiants. John Joseph, who's a United Church minister, a gay man, had organized a coven of clergy from diverse traditions to officiate at this mass same-sex wedding. And we ended up, I think, with about 120 couples getting married. So I agreed to that. And I said to Troy, I said, do you want to get married? We don't have to plan the party. They're planning the party for us, he's like, we don't need a piece of paper and we're busy and you're speaking and doing this and I'm performing because he's a singer as well and so on. And so I put it aside. And on the day of the wedding took place at Casa Loma. The mass wedding was taking place at Casa Loma, Toronto's castle. And it's up on the hill and it's gorgeous. And it's now become an event space and a wedding space and so on. And he proposed to me. We were getting dressed and I laughed and I said, well, you can't propose to me in the closet. You have to, if you're serious, you have to propose to me, outside of the closet. And we laughed and we went to the wedding and it was a beautiful day. And there must have been 1,000 people there. And it was it was June the 26th. And I was wearing a shalwar kameez, and this a reporter came up to me, a South Asian woman, Angie Seth, and said, oh, you look great. You must be so excited getting married. And I was like, I'm not getting married. I'm doing the marriages, right? I'm marrying, not getting married. Long story short, she ends up interviewing me and Troy and says, why aren't you guys married? And I said, ask him. And so he proposed. And it was an unplanned wedding. And the marriage was officiated at that time. So we had a multi-faith union ceremony. And so we'd gone this far. The next day was Jummah, and it was our Pride Jummah. So I asked John Joseph, we got a marriage license in the morning from City Hall, and I asked him to come to the masjid and for Jummah and to officiate there. So it was a non-religious wedding. And so then we're in September 2014, we're in Cape Town. And we had discussed, Troy and I had discussed this before, and I'd sent Amina an email about whether she would officiate for us, and she brushed me aside. And, and so we put it on hold, and we went to Cape Town to this conference, and it was awesome, and it was amazing. And one lunchtime, Troy and I were sitting, and Amina was sitting at the table just behind us. And Amina, I can't remember who you were talking to. You were talking to one other person, female, but I can't remember who it was. And Fisura leaned over and said, "Can we talk to you?" And I remember you saying something like, "Why are you grinning like Cheshire cats?" And we asked Amina, and there was, and she agreed, alhamdulillah. And there was another wedding that was taking place, and this is how things are so interconnected. There was already another wedding taking place. It was a female couple, both were Pakistani. One of the women had gotten asylum in the United States, but she couldn't bring her partner who was left back in Pakistan, because America didn't recognize that as their common law relationship as a relationship. So they met in South Africa, where the Pakistani, the partner who was still in Pakistan could get a visa to and get married there, because there was equal marriage in Pakistan, sorry, in South Africa. In Pakistan, that'll be the day. So they could get this marriage, they could get married in South Africa, so that the partner who had gotten asylum in the United States could go back in the United States and put her wife on her green card application. They were really happy. We had to ask their permission because the wedding party was for them, and they were like, "We don't want all the attention, please do this." And so we were really thankful that people opened up the space and so on. And so that was the first nikah, and so far the only nikah that Amina has officiated. And she hasn't met her nephew yet in real life, and inshallah he will be 4 in June. And I think that's about at least 15 minutes. So I think I'll stop then. But that's how we're more. I would like to think that we're more than friends along the way. Amina is my sister, my friend, my mentor, and my teacher. And it is my honor to have accepted this invitation to be here with her tonight. So.
Thank you so very much. Wow, such a thrilling life. I will reiterate some of the points from my own perspective, because when I first met Elfie, I felt immediately that it was possible for me to be completely authentic about myself. So things that I had questions about, or things that I was beginning to investigate in greater depth with regard to gender identities, I didn't have to self-censor. And that became really, really important, because in the space where, as he mentioned, I not only did not have my luggage arrive, but at the time I was also taking medications for seasonal affective disorder, depression and anxiety. And when I didn't have that medicine, then my insomnia was worse. So I couldn't sleep well. And then I couldn't, adjust to things, because it were just like emotionally overwhelming, because I had used the drugs the way people use drugs. I drugged myself. And the event that was organized by the Noor Center was one where, I was assaulted by certain members verbally in the audience. I've written about it in Inside the Gender Jihad. I'm not going to linger on it. Just to say that the contrast between the space where I had been invited And the space where an ad hoc opening of his personal home to me was so stark. In a way, you know, the comfort that I felt in his presence led me into a false sense of the possibility of also just being transparent when I spoke at the Noor Center, and they were not ready because, you know, people would call me out on things that do with race. And I said, I know what you're asking me, I'm just a nigga. And that was, you know, before things got viral, that kind of went out there. So when you look in the Inside the Gender Jihad, you'll see that as a way to indicate that's one of the stories that I tell. The good news is that everything about the negative event was eclipsed by our life as friends together from then on. And my perspective on these matters, and I've been asked this recently in some interviews, is I just have to work with the positive. I'm too old to go chasing around stories, you know, that didn't work towards the affirmation of my humanity and my possibilities of completing whatever it is that Allah has assigned for me while I'm in this, you know, human form. So I only dwell on the positive, and the good news is, even though, and I regret that it's been so many years that we haven't met face to face or given a hug. That's my new thing. My post-corona reality is I'm going to hug everybody. Even though we haven't met face to face, we still manage to maintain a connection. And I think that, you know, given any opportunity to be within the same non-social distance space, we will, you know, we will always be relaxed and, you know, forthcoming. And I very much appreciate that, because actually, I don't think that I've been welcomed by a stranger at the level that I was welcomed when I was there, to the extent that it made a lifelong difference, and a lifelong difference on issues that are really important to me. So I really, I mean, I just want to, you know, give you my love for the immediate embracing that you did of me, and all of the ways in which we have continued. It's particularly important for me to showcase el-Farouk, because his demonstration of the ways in which queer Muslims have to negotiate for their love and intimacy, for their prosperity. I mean, people lose jobs because of their sexual orientation, and their capacity to be active in the community. It hasn't come up, but he's run for political office in Toronto. So, you know, he's like multifaceted in terms of his application of his own ethical principles to the way in which he lives on all fronts. And I'm sure he is aware of the privilege that he has to be in a country where you can put four names on the birth certificate, is already a privilege that a lot of people can't have because of the ways in which the laws support punitive responses to people's differences across the spectrum. And also because actually, I think after meeting Faisal, who was just beginning to initiate activities with regard to queer Muslim identity and their Islamic identities, and that's where I was really hooked, because it was easy for me to, you know, sort of support same-sex relations and you know, sexual divergent, you know, identities, because the brother just older than me, you know, may Allah be pleased with him on his return, he was always gay. So in other words, my life was always connected in a loving relationship with someone, you know, who is non-heteronormative. And I couldn't have anything but, you could, I mean, I've seen instances of hate even within my own family, but for me, I couldn't have anything but a love relationship. However, the question is, as a Muslim, how do I affirm those identities? And it became really clear to me that the affirmations that I had made in terms of the secular guise, and by that I mean in my university, for example, you could take a 2-day course to mark your office as a safe space for LGBTQI. But this marker was on the basis of the rules and the affirmations within not only the law, but the particular university policies. And yet, of course, young queer students face, persecution, discrimination, and exclusion. So I had attended that course, and I had that marker, on my office, so I could be welcoming, and it teaches you how to be affirming when you're even in the classroom. I had done that, but I had never really done anything that had to do with Islam in any guise, except that I was Muslim. And so really the beginning of me working out how I could do that and do that authentically, and at the same time, how I could do it based on the privilege of study that I, have had in Islam and Islamic sources. That came through my relationship with Faisal and el-Farouk, because notice the names of the efforts that he has made. They're all related to Muslim identity in the most peaceful and, affirming way. And in fact, they are things like mosques. And the beginning of the inclusive mosque initiatives, rests on the shoulders of someone like el-Farouk. And from the inclusive mosque initiatives, all the women's mosque initiatives sprang. So the first spaces that were inclusive and the first spaces that had women as imams were spaces that were organized by queer Muslims. And that became my hook. As long as the spiritual identity was oriented towards Islam, I had something to offer. And so I could be both a recipient, because there's so much that I learned, but I could also offer from the small amount of privilege that Allah has given me in terms of the study of Islam. And now I have a location, I think, that's based on straddling the knowledge and the spirituality with an affirmation of queer identity. And that is, that's my most comfortable home. I don't have any qualms with retracing the history, because for me, that history has been very personal and it has been very loving. I miss you a lot, Elfie, and I hope one day to hug you all, and that things will be at a higher level of normal than they were before we reached into the pandemic. I wanted to ask you, by way of start the conversations of questions and the like, I wanted to ask you, how did you personally understand, because you're a lawyer, so you run for political office, you live in a secular country that affirms religious diversity, but how did you individually understand the significance of the role of Islam and Islamic spirituality to your activism and your politics?
So, people sometimes say that your religion is your choice, but I don't think it is. I think that Allah in the Quran tells us that if Allah had wanted everyone to be Muslim, that they would be Muslim, but the diversity is Allah's tapestry. And my family is Muslim, and it's how I grew up, and it was a very important part of my identity and certainly my spirituality. Some people can walk away from those identities. I'm not sure. I mean, I see organizations.
And some people are forced away from those identities.
And a lot of people are forced away and traumatized away. And I think it's even hard for even those people to walk away, because you have organizations for ex-Muslims, and there's still a grappling of identity and history and so on and so forth. But that wasn't my path. And my family has an interesting journey within Islam, from sect to sect, to where I am now, and where I think my household is, and my mother and my aunt and a few other folks along in the family unit, which is that we don't identify sectarianly. Call it universalist, call it non-denominational, but I'm not interested. I call myself Sunni normative, because I say my salat Sunni style, and I was sort of you know, my family started out Shia Ismaili, ended up Sunni, and then sort of like, wait, these are all historical, political, and so on and so forth. So for me, distilling truth and essence for myself, and the one thing that my dad, may he rest in peace and power, always told me is that God's greatest gift to us was our intellect, was our aql, and that as Muslims we were indebted to use it, and so I brought that to my understanding of religion, and you know, in terms of coming to terms with myself as Muslim and as a gay man, the trauma that I had when I first realized my sexual orientation was the traditional understanding of the story of Lot, that there's something wrong with me, and having to pray every night that I'd wake up straight. It never happened, but it was a lot of prayer. I wish I directed it to more fruitful endeavors, but I dwelled on the question as to how I could be punished for something that was God created and God given. And that has been a process and a journey. I owe my journey and the growth in my journey to a lot of different folks, one of whom is Guy, my late partner, who was an ex-Catholic who had traumas in the Catholic faith because there was a division in his family between Catholics and evangelicals and so on and so forth, and the notion of being saved and all of that. So he had given up organized or institutionalized religion. And so his questions that would challenge me on why women can't be imams and this and that and so on and so forth. And I will admit that some of my answers back then were not the answers that I would give today, alhamdulillah. And that has been a journey for me and a process. And I think that we need to recognize that where we are today as individuals is also part of that. And also to try to be, I have to remind myself to sometimes be gentle or to give space to other folks in terms of their journeys, and that an open heart is the most important thing. An open heart and an engaged mind, and so that's been my journey, dealing with this truism of I can't be condemned for something that I actually for the way that I'm actually made. And I see things, this notion of Tawheed, that everything is connected and interconnected with each other. So the premise of my theology is that you can't have queer equality or queer liberation within Islam unless there is gender equality or gender, because to me, misogyny and homophobia and transphobia are flip sides of the same coin, all minted by patriarchy. And you can't address one without addressing the other. And, you know, I want to affirm what you said, Ami, that the inclusive mosque initiatives that have arisen over the years have essentially been queer spaces that have put women at the minbar in our contemporary collective history today. Unfortunately, sometimes that's a little bit erased in certain narratives and in certain stories, but that's really the truth. I think I answered your question.
I think it's really nice to receive a calling based on, you know, our own locations, our own identities, and from that calling to help to build a movement, you know, a reality of expressions of a multifaceted participation in our sacred worship. So I'm just so thrilled that you are my brother, and I love you. And, you know, as I said, I'm not going to get into this hug thing again because I might start crying. I can't wait to hug you. So we're going to open up to the gallery. And if you have not put something in the chat and you want to, you know, just speak directly, I believe you have the option next to your name where you see where it says, participant. If you look in there, there's a space for you to sort of, what's the word, virtually raise your hand, and that allows for a little bit of organization, which I, as an obsessive person, need. Otherwise, you may use the chat, and I can recognize you from there. Take advantage of this opportunity because this is one of our, 4 parents in the struggle for inclusive sacred spaces in Islam. And this is a wonderful opportunity for you. In the meantime, yes, I think I'm going to go with Deanna. Please, you want to ask a question or make a comment? You have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you so much for everything that you shared. There was a lot that was really resonant and heartfelt, especially your journey with your family. I wanted to ask something that came up as you were speaking that I felt like I wanted to ask, and hopefully you feel good about answering. In your experience and on your journey to self-actualization as a queer Muslim and all these intersections that you hold, and as a queer Muslim parent now, how do you stay grounded in the essence of Rahma when facing the multi-dimensional layers of your history and of your trauma specifically? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Let me see if I understand. I think I understand it. If I miss it, tell me otherwise. Okay. I think so. I'm 57. Okay. And I remember and Islam before oil money took over all of our masjids, right? And so the notion of a singular historical tradition is a falsehood that we are being fed. My family and my own journey within Islam was always grounded in a spirituality. And so I belong to a Sufi community, and before I belonged to a Sufi community, I certainly had Sufi practices within my own, integrated into my practice. I believe that any religion without spirituality is simply a list of do's and don'ts, and that it is toxic. And I think that, so for me, my grounding is within spirituality, and I'm from Vancouver, I'm from British Columbia, and your spirituality comes from, and Anne is from the West Coast as well. And my spirituality is walking on the beach as well, and hugging a tree. And I was telling the story the other day that I think it was last month or the month before, it was a full moon, and I had seen that earlier. And then after it was midnight, and I went outside on the deck, and it was like minus something, and I was all bundled up, and I started doing zikr under the moon. And there's a high rise that's sort of just off to the side, and I'm sure that there's people who sort of look down and often wonder what's going on my rooftop. But I try to find the divine. I was really inspired, Ami, by your comment about not dwelling on the bad things of the past. And maybe the next step for me is also then to also not dwell on the bad things of the present and look to the promise of the future. I always say that activists are optimists, and but I think that's also grounded in a practice of spirituality, right? And that this too shall pass. Plus, I think that we undermine our own resilience. I think we're a lot more resilient than sometimes people would like to think that they are. Our people are survivors. Many of us come from, doesn't matter where you come from, our ancestors have gone through a lot for us to be here today. Some more than others, for sure. But I think that for many of us, we are one of my friends, Pastor David Pert, always says we stand on the shoulders of giants, right? And
Yeah,
let's
I
acknowledge
also,
that resilience.
I just want to jump in here to say, you know, I'm 68, so now I'm already counting that, you know, I'm 70. And I only mention it because the idea of actually embodying the location of dwelling on the positive was by no means easy for me. In fact, part of my critical work is looking critically at things. And to do that, even when the glass is, you know, 8/10 full, I'm focusing on that 2/10. And so that's my sort of intellectual orientation. But as I strengthened my practice, and also as I found community, because as I said, the queer Muslim community just offered so much for me that I couldn't get in the mainstream, especially conservative community context. But as I strengthened my own spiritual practice, I came to this idea that, you know, the distance between my present time and the grave is much shorter than the distance between the cradle and my present time. And if I want to reach the grave in affirmation and love, then I need to let some of this shit go, you know? And, you know, I mean, but, you know, but my natural inclination is to dwell on those things. And I've, you know, actually done some really good work because of dwelling on those things, like what's missing in the Quranic narrative. Well, the female voice is missing. But if you're not looking at that, you know, 2/10, then you'll just miss it, kind of thing, right? So there's been some merit to that. But spiritually, it was a bit of a hindrance. And then one day I just thought, if I want to live, then the affirmation of the life that I have been given, then I need to stop carrying that baggage. And that does not mean that you got to wait that long. I definitely think that we can, you know, work collectively to start helping each of us to lift arbitrary burdens off of our shoulders. And when we lift that burden, we will be energized to participate more in the things that affirm, you know.
And
And yes, please, I'm going to just.
can I just add to that, that sometimes that burden, sometimes that shit isn't ours, it's just dumped on us, right? So,
Anne, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you for everything that's been said so far and the question preceding mine. I would like you, el-Farouk, and first of all, and also thank you for sending me an invitation to this. I'm so glad you did. I'm wondering, you mentioned that the answers you gave to your former partner about certain issues in Islam, the answers you would give today are very different than the answers that you gave then. And I'm just wondering if you would be willing to share some of the turning points, some of the people you encountered, what happened in your life, experiences you had that caused you to, you know, de-rust your heart, you know, open, you know, it talks about resting of the heart in the Quran. And what were some of those experiences where you said, wait a minute, okay, I got to shift here?
So I think my location within the Muslim community was a part of that, right? And I'm a mama's boy. Mama's online. You know, I'm an only child. We were a displaced family. I was always close to my mother. My dad was always out saving the world. So we had to leave Africa. We were actually, dad left first, mom and I had to leave after, surreptitiously, blah blah blah. We're in England for 2.5 years, and then we end up
around me
in Vancouver, right? And I was always struck by the injustice Now, in the Ismaili community, women are much more integrated into ritual and into community life. In the Sunni community and in the community that we found ourselves in British Columbia, in Vancouver, that was not the case. And it always struck me as being unjust. And again, I was never sent to a madrasa or anything like that because my dad didn't want me indoctrinated by folks that he didn't agree with. And so I was taught religion at home. And for 2.5 years when we were in England, I went to Christian assembly every morning so that I would learn that. But it was always understood that we were Muslim and a little bit different. So I was always in this place of minority. You know, I'm a brown person from Black Africa. Then we're in England. Then we're in Vancouver, and even like going to the Sunni masjid. And I'm from Africa, and people would speak to me sometimes in Urdu or Hindi or Arabic, or when I was out somewhere, because Vancouver is a large Iranian population, people would speak to me in Farsi. And English is my first language. I come from colonized British Africa, right? We spoke English in the home. And yet I would get comments like, well, he doesn't even speak Urdu at the moment, you know, and stuff like that. So it was always being that outsider. My family was too Sunni, as Ismailis, there were two Sunnis, as Sunnis, there were two non-conformist, and so on and so forth. I always found it, the allocation of space, both physical and non-physical space to women in the Muslim community was unjust. And so even before I began my queer activism, one of the organizations that I work with and that the mosque works with is the Canadian Council of Muslim Women. It's filled with my aunties from when I was a teenager, right? And so always been supportive of those kinds of spaces. The rationale, for example, so one of the questions is, why can't women lead prayer? And I remember Guy asking me that. And I gave him, you know, the same normality crap that people still feed. But in the process of my advocacy and my work, that started to not make sense, right? I think one of the most significant turning points, though, is my work as a refugee lawyer. And I've dealt with refugee claims from 120 different countries based on all sorts of things, not just sexual orientation or gender identity or gender expression or gender or HIV, but politics, religion, this, that, and the other. I couldn't advocate for their dignity if I didn't affirm everyone's dignity equally. And I think one of the most significant turning points for me in my journey was representing transsexual women from Latin America back in the 90s. Because transsexuals weren't even accepted fully as partners within the larger LGBTIQ community. And I have to say that, you know, there wasn't a lot of information and who would you meet and where would you meet them, maybe in bars and so on and so forth. So I had to get through my own, I had to embrace fully the humanity of the people I was representing. So I had to understand that, and I had to cut through all of that, because I can't tell you that their human rights and their human dignity are being infringed if I cannot affirm them. So that's why my work with refugees and that recognition of their dignity, of their dignity and their rights has such a profound connection to my spirituality and to my religious activism. So I think that, and that has all been a process of that, no singular step, but a process and a journey. So.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's really lovely. I think, you know, if long as we are growing, changing, accepting challenges, then we have access to continually polishing the heart and, you know, arriving at different states of wellness. I wanted to just chat with you for a second about the initiative that I'm trying to bring into fruition, which is a queer Islamic studies and theology starting here in Indonesia, the National Islamic University, where it's been affirmed on my contract, but obviously all of the bureaucracy about how to make it come into being is not written up. So I'm still seeing what are the possibilities. But I just wondered if you had any thoughts about one aspect of it that I want to try to continue to prioritize is the way in which living queer Muslim sacred practices and programs have led the way, not only, as I said, in terms of the women's mosque movements, but also in terms of rethinking the notions of sacred space so that barriers of exclusion could be lifted. You mentioned, for example, that you guys started off just on Skype. I remember those days. I also had a wonderful opportunity myself when you invited me to do the khutbah for Eid al-Adha last year. And I had an opportunity to revisit another one of those trauma stories that have been 20 years in my life, the story of Hajar. But what do you think about, I mean, I'm inspired because in the cisgendered women's movement, we talked about live reality as a rubric of analysis, that you can't understand, for example, the concept of justice unless those who are not experiencing justice, are part of the conversation. But I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about just strategically how to maintain the actual activism and spirituality that has come about through queer inclusive spaces in Islam, so that I can kind of springboard off of that as it's sort of a vague idea in my head, and I'm committed to it. But of course, I never created anything. I was an invited, imam here or there, but you have created lots of different forum, experienced the pushback and just the sheer, weight of trying to kickstart something that was unusual. And now it's moving, very well. You have any recommendations for me in terms of how to think about that as a specific component to the study of Islam and queer identity?
I'm not quite sure I get the question, but let me try it, okay? I think narrative is a really important tool of learning and unlearning. So when folks sometimes come to the mosque for the first time, they often have visceral reactions. Some people have walked away. Samra Habib writes in her book, We've Always Been Here, that she went home and she bawled her eyes out because everything that she had been told about what she couldn't do and where she couldn't be and so on in the masjid crumbled when she came to Jummah at the Unity Mosque. And I know from LGBT rights and campaigns that telling lived stories, lived experiences are always the most transformative. And so I think if I understand at least an element of your question as to how we springboard, I think telling narratives and telling stories of people's journeys within and to Islam, and how these spaces have made that possible. The flip side being how people are chased out of Islam and so on, becomes the foundation of why these kinds of spaces are necessary. And one of the things that I often get asked is, how do you negotiate space with, and I don't call them mainstream, I call them dominant culture, dominant Muslim culture spaces, because I don't know what's mainstream about them, right? But I'm not interested in changing their space. If they're happy where they are, so be it. But their Islam doesn't actually address everybody's needs. And there's never been one Islam. And there is not one Islam today. And we can see this as quite simply within Shia Sunni differences, within even Sunni tariqas and sects within Sufi communities, and within Shiism. I'm not interested in changing their space. I'm interested, I always take it from the approach that I'm interested in creating a space that for people whose needs are not being met in those spaces. And I think narrative is a very important part of that. I'm not sure that, Ami, if that addresses your question.
Yeah, it's helpful. I'm a text person and, I do humanities. So I get, I love theology and abstract. And I was transformed, by joining, Muslim women activists like 30 years ago. And it really shaped even my theology. And in order to promote the study of queer Islamic theologies, I want to remind myself, if nothing else, how important is the narrative, because I see it, I've experienced it, and I've certainly benefited from it. But it's not my strength. So I thought, I would just ask. So, I think that's really very helpful. And also it just lets us know that lived realities for Muslims shapes the Islam's that's important.
Yeah,
We would
for
have
those of
time
us-
for one more question before he responds again. So just think about it, because we're going to be close.
You have a question from Genevieve in the chat box.
Oh, okay. See, when I have my bifocals on, I tend not to see very well. Thank you so much for this discussion. It's really wonderful to hear these reflections. I wanted to ask, in parenting, how do you plan to discuss with your child how the broader Muslim community feels about progressive, affirming, universalist Islam?
So Genevieve is part of Unity Mosque, and we've actually begun a kids program. We're in our second Sunday tomorrow, inshallah, or today for you. And Genevieve and their partner have two kids, and that are around the same age as Tajami. And that's a really good question. Genevieve, I'm not quite sure. I said at the beginning about the fact that we, for example, can't go to certain countries because of what our family unit looks like, and so on and so forth. That's going to be lived reality, that there are certain places that we won't be able to go together until he's older and doesn't need a parental, like a parent to get them through a border and so on and so forth. How I don't know whether I'm going to. I don't think that we're ever going to go into those kinds of spaces and places. And as I was saying earlier, I made a decision to not go to dominant cultures mosques because I didn't find them respectful to women. And a lot of times I was completely isolated because I didn't fit with the ethno-cultural composition of the community and so on. So my family is sort of spread over. They are parts of different Muslim religious communities or practice Islam within their home rather than in community. So it's not something that I've actually sort of thought about, but I think that with the number of people that are around us, both in real life and cybernetically, that obviously at some point he's going to know that there are other Islams, but I'm not making a big deal, just as we're not making a big deal about our family composition. Some people have two babas, some people have two mamas, some people have one of each, some people only have one of whatever gender or non-gender, right? So trying to bring him up with this is our life and this is normal, and that's the kind of Islam that I would like to bring him up. And when he is old enough to understand that that's not the only kind of Islam, we'll deal with that when we do. But I like to talk about tapestries and diversity, and they're like us. They're Muslim too, but they're not quite like us, dear. And sort of deal with it that way. It's a tough question, but I think that for those of us who live in pluralistic societies, who have that privilege, that we can make those kinds of choices as to who we're around and so on, right? Um,
There's a comment from Umma in regards to knowing. It's important to remember that transgender folks are banned from entering the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and banned from making Hajj and Umrah. I think it is different for LGBT people and cis heteronormative folks. Yeah, to a certain extent, there are layers of exclusion, and Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is definitely known for practicing those layers of exclusion and repression. Unfortunately, because the sacred uh, direction is there, and so we make the pilgrimage there. Sometimes you end up trying to negotiate how you can fulfill that sacred duty and not, I want to say it explicitly the way that I experienced it, because I did not get access to say my salams to the Prophet in the Prophet's mosque in Medina, not get waylaid by the restrictions. And there's just different ways that people have to negotiate that. And unfortunately, the work ahead of us with regard to the full spectrum of human dignity, I don't see ending in my lifetime. And on the one hand, it provides opportunities to continue to do things. But on the other hand, it's sometimes depressing and disappointing. So we have to keep struggling, across all levels of resistance. But as I said, I am particularly thrilled by my brother el-Farouk's contribution to a continuous trajectory of affirmation. And I hope you join me and in virtual applause. And I will see you all later. I'm just going to unrecord and then we can chat for just a bit.